Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 147, and the three guests that I have got lined up are all on holiday. So what we're doing today is a clip show with some little bits taken from here and there that you may have missed, but I think you'll enjoy hearing. And the first port of call is the United States, where the Chief Franken-What's-It made a speech of such insight and clarity, I think you'll all be amazed.
You know what uranium is, right? It's a thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of things are done with uranium, including some bad things.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm terrified. But that was very short. I'll just play it another time just so you can hear it again.
You know what uranium is, right? It's a thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of things are done with uranium, including some bad things.
Bloody Nora. One thing I've noticed in life, though, is that any newspaper headline that begins with Texas lawmaker is usually followed by something that I find more than perturbing. However, I did see one a few weeks ago that made me revisit that position. I'll just read it out here for you. You fascist, loofah-faced shit-gibbon. State lawmaker unloads on Trump for threatening Texas senator. And I really have to give 10 out of 10 for creativity there, and I also find it hard to disagree with anything in the sentence. Time to move on, though. I'm sure many of the listeners to this show are well aware of the activities of Murdo Fraser, but sometimes it doesn't seem like he is. Here's Murdo's little exchange with Ivan McKee in the Parliament recently.
But if he has time, can I suggest he takes a look at the 1986 John Hughes classic, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where a young Matthew Broderick sits in a class of bored teenagers listening to Ben Steen's economics teacher trying to explain to them the principles of the Laffer curve. Anyone seen that, presiding officer? Anyone? Oh, Mr. McKee has seen it. He can instruct the finance secretary about it.
Ivan McKee. Fraser's very frequently mentions a Laffer curve in this place. I just want to ask him for a single peak Laffer curve at a point of inflection, with the rate of change of revenues with respect to rates, dr by dt equals zero. Can Mr. Fraser enlighten us whether he believes that we're currently in a range where dr by dt is greater than zero or less than zero, and why? Or does his understanding of Laffer curves only extend to sound bites and he's got no idea what he's actually talking about?
Well, Mr. Fraser, no.
Well, unfortunately, I couldn't hear Mr. McKee's question.
No.
That was the hilarity. The hilarity in general.
Mr. Fraser,
Listen.
Mr. Fraser, sit down.
Okay.
I think no further commentary is required on that other than the word telt. The next piece is in keeping with the excellent films that Phantom Power's been putting out recently, talking with people who've made the journey from no to yes, and this is another person who did the same thing. Chris Graham, who's now one of the indie bikers, but last time round was no. He explains why and how he thinks we should move forward.
Next, guys, I'm really delighted to announce that we have a no voter coming up to speak next. Chris Graham. Chris voted no and then realised the mistake he'd made, and he started a little group called I'm Now Yes. And it's astonishingly enough, he now is one of the leaders of the Yes Bikers too. It's an absolute pleasure, Chris. Come on up, buddy. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. So, yes, I voted no. Right? There are many like me. Right? There's one problem with the Yes campaign who make fun of no voters. You're never going to win someone's opinion if you keep attacking them and attacking them and attacking them. The only way to win this movement is by showing that we are the better people. We have to take the high ground. We have to put forward the great ideas that are part of this campaign. Right? The idea of my page was set up because people need to share their stories. Okay? I have a story. I voted no because I honestly felt that was the best thing to do. I was wrong. People have made this mistake. The only way we can show them is by being polite, kind, and showing them exactly how Scotland needs independence for a positive future. So in order to do that, we have to speak, we have to be social, attend events like this, invite people who are no voters to come along, get people to share their story. Everyone has a reason for what they do in life, and the only way we can convince them to change that reason is by talking. My speech here today is really short, because all it needs to be is short, is talk. Speak to no voters, even if you don't like them, even the hardcore unionists who don't want to listen to you. Speak to them. Be that better side. Be the Yes campaign in 2014, which were out every weekend, every day, showing family, support, and just what Scotland should be in the future. So again, please just speak to a no voter, speak to your family, your friends, anyone in the street, but get the idea of independence out there. And if you can, come support all the groups, like Yes 2, all under one banner, Yes Bikers. Everyone needs your support, because with that, we can have a nice, clean, nuclear-free, independent Scotland. Thank you.
Indeed. The next thing up is exactly along the same lines, but it's from a few years ago. Actually, it's from before the first referendum, but it's an Englishman living in Scotland explaining why he changed his mind about Scottish independence. However, I'm going to warn you beforehand that there are a few things in here that will probably get your hackles up, both from the speaker and from the interviewer, who seems to be quite obviously pushing a certain line, I'll just say that. But despite that, it's quite interesting also from a historical perspective, even though it was 5 years ago. There's some things that are worthy of taking note of. Give it a listen and try to think of the interview as a whole rather than one or two of the individual comments that, as I've said, may irk you slightly.
Someone who's already contacted us is Dr. Alex Wolfe. He heard the SNP leader on PM the other week and wrote to say, "I enjoyed listening to your interview with Alex Salmond as I drove home just now. What would be interesting is if, as part of your coverage in the run-up to the referendum, PM could also investigate the views of people like you and I, who now live and work on the other side of the border from that on which they grew up."
It's a good idea, and that's why we want to hear from you, ipm@bbc.co.uk. Dr. Wolfe is from Bexhill-on-Sea in Sussex. He moved to Scotland in 1997, where these days he lectures in medieval history at St Andrews University.
I came up as a typical southeastern English person, no Scottish ancestry, with all the kind of cultural assumptions that go with that.
What were these assumptions?
Well, I think I thought about the national question. I thought that whilst I've always been someone who's believed in greater level of local government, maybe is a better way to put it, in the way that the Liberal Democrats used to present it as being a good idea, I thought full independence was just something for kind of the sort of people who watched Braveheart and thought it was the best film ever made, and a lot of flag-waving jingoistic people, the kind of Scottish equivalent of the BNP, I suppose. And to begin with, when I came up here and I met apparently intelligent people who were strong nationalists, I sort of argued against them and used all the general arguments about Scotland being small and that there isn't any real anti-Scottish prejudice. It's just that the greater part of the population live elsewhere, so obviously the Scots are less represented in sort of cultural and political life. And that was my kind of starting position when I arrived here in the 90s.
And it was an interesting time to be there, because I think you arrived just after the devolution referendum.
Yes, that's right. My temporary post was in Wales. I voted in the devolution referendum in Wales and then moved to Scotland almost instantly, and then got to vote in the first devolved parliamentary election here rather than in Ceredigion.
And at that time, there was such debate about the future, and you were there for part of it. And was that when your views maybe began to move a little, or has that happened over the years since?
I think it's happened relatively gradually. I mean, when I first arrived, I can remember that a friend I already knew who was based in Edinburgh, who I stayed with while I was looking for a flat, and who worked for one of the government agencies, but was English, from Somerset, was really worried that devolution would mean that it would affect her chances of promotion, possibly even that she'd lose her job because there'd be preference given to native Scots over English immigrants. I recently did a site visit in Aberdeenshire with her and another colleague, and she's now become very pro-independence. And I think it's associated with the disillusion with the Blair government. And in 1997, the same year that I moved to Scotland, there was that great general election change, and we all thought that everything was going to change, but what we got was another smug public school boy who was out of touch, to use Nadine Dorris's term. And I think there's a sense that what's really changing up here, and why people like me and my friend Sally and others who perhaps aren't traditionally part of that hardcore nationalist movement are now becoming more inclined towards separatism, is that we haven't actually changed our beliefs about what we want. It's how we want the country we live in to be. And we're giving up hope on Westminster ever delivering that. We want to save Britain. We want to build Jerusalem anew in this green and pleasant land. But we've given up hope that that'll ever be possible with the Westminster structures and the built-in dominance of an entrenched historical elite. The burden of history is too great in the Westminster structures, so we might as well try and save part of the island, if not all of it. Alex Salmond is giving us an option to have a country that has a new constitution, a proper parliament that's truly representative. When I first came up here, I think I shared that view that a lot of the Scottish Parliament politicians were a bit second-rate. They're a bit ordinary and dowdy-looking. You think about people like Nicola Sturgeon and Joe McAlpine, and they're the sort of people you imagine standing behind in the queue in the supermarket. But then I've come to realise that actually that's what you want in representative democracy. You want people who represent their constituents, who are like us. You don't want this kind of Teflon superheroes who are out of touch and belong to an elite class and have no idea about the price of a pint of milk.
How well is the UK-wide media doing the job of conveying what you experience?
I don't think they're doing it very well. You do get occasional accounts, programmes, things, obviously, but I think generally both the UK media and the Westminster politicians are presenting the national question as if it's these sort of the die-hard radical nationalists, flag-waving jingoists who are the enemy, and if that's what's the debate here. But in fact, they're the people who never change their mind anyway. They're not addressing the potential floating voters, people like myself, who will actually make the difference if we have the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues. What people here are interested in is having something more like a Scandinavian government style, greater equality. So, for example, there's this big debate about whether or not Scotland will be better or worse off, but what people look at is GDP. Well, it's not the GDP that matters to society, it's how it's distributed. If we have a smaller GDP, but the money is better distributed, then we have a better economy for the people of Scotland or of Britain. So I think there's too much focus on that kind of business agenda and on the vested interests, and also a misunderstanding of what people are interested in here. People are interested in social equality. They're impressed with not having to pay tuition fees, not having to pay for medical prescriptions and so on. And those are priorities that the Scottish people have chosen to back. And if it means we cut down on some other areas, then that's fine, but it isn't about waving flags.
If you were running the No campaign, how would you seek to appeal to the voters?
I think I would de-stress the nationalist aspect of it. I would look at real constitutional reform and promise it, things like the House of Lords and so on. I don't think simply trying to diss Scottish government and Scottish potential is really realistic, because we all know Scotland isn't that small. If you listed it amongst the list of the world's countries, it's bigger than quite a lot of countries that are fully independent. The economy may or may not be a bit worse off if it were devolved, but it's certainly not something one can predict. Partly, we all know how the economy has. Your friend Robert Peston is very, very well versed on how random the economic movements are in the world. So we can't really predict where any of us will be in 10 or 20 years' time.
A friend of mine who's Scottish and works in London, but is often in Scotland and still has a home there, says to me that essentially Scotland already is independent. And it's not saying that from some starkly personal political viewpoint. It's just his impression of how people talk and how people feel is that there is a completely different vibe, for want of a better word, about how Scots see themselves. Does that chime with your experience?
Yes, absolutely. I think it really does feel like that. And I think in some ways the danger for Scots in the present constitutional situation is that they don't realise the areas that Westminster still does control. So they think they're independent and they're likely to not turn up for Westminster elections and not take them that seriously. There is a sense that we're a community and we're a much more accessible community. There's much more interaction between the people at the bottom and the people at the top. And the news and everything up here is all about living in Scotland. I think we are very much independent. And one of the things people say, some of the soft unionists, if you like, is why do we need to change anything? We're running everything ourselves now anyway.
Could I tempt you back to Sussex?
They don't teach medieval history in the university there. Although I must admit it does look prettier now than I did when I grew up. The thing I really miss about the southern Britain is the trees. There's very few places, some bits of maybe Argyll and a lot of Galloway and the borders have wonderful wooded hillsides and things, but that's the thing that now strikes me as so beautiful when I go back down to the south. I love the island of Britain. I'd like to save it all, but I don't think that's an option. I can only save Scotland.
Are you Scottish?
I suppose I'm Scottish, but I'm not a Scot. It's like the difference between being a Serb or a Serbian. A Serbian lives